In the hour before dawn, when the world rests between darkness and light, the ancient city of Rome began its gentle awakening. The sky, still draped in the deep indigo of night, held the faintest promise of morning along its eastern edge. Stars lingered overhead, their light softening as the earth turned slowly toward the sun. In these quiet moments, before the city fully stirred, there existed a particular kind of peace, a stillness that belonged neither to night nor day, but to the space between them. The first sounds emerged as whispers against the silence. Somewhere in the distance a wooden cartwheel creaked along stone pavement. The soft shuffle of sandaled feet moved through narrow streets, their rhythm unhurried, familiar. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The air carried the coolness of night still, fresh and clean, untouched yet by the warmth that would arrive with the climbing sun. Rome in these early hours belonged to those who rose before the city woke, who moved through shadows with purpose shaped by generations of routine. Along the pathways leading toward the heart of the city, figures began to appear. Farmers who had travelled since the middle of the night, their carts laden with produce from the countryside. Bakers whose ovens had been burning since the darkest hours, filling their shops with the gentle fragrance of bread. Merchants who opened their stalls before light touched the Forum stones, arranging goods by the glow of oil lamps that flickered like earthbound stars. These were the keepers of Rome's daily rhythm, the ones who prepared the stage upon which the city's life would unfold. The markets of Rome were more than places of exchange. They were the living pulse of the eternal city, the spaces where Rome breathed and moved and sustained itself. Every transaction, every conversation, every moment of haggling or greeting or shared laughter contributed to a vast, intricate tapestry of human connection. To understand Rome, one had to understand its markets. To feel the heartbeat of the empire, one had to stand among its stalls and breathe the mingled scents of spices, fresh bread, olive oil, and stone warmed by generations of footsteps. As the sky began its slow transformation from indigo to pearl grey, the first vendors arrived at the Forum Romanum. They came with bundles balanced on shoulders, with baskets carried in weathered hands, with the quiet confidence of those who knew their place in the city's daily choreography. The Forum, still shadowed and cool, waited patiently for the life that would soon fill its ancient spaces. The stones underfoot, worn smooth by countless thousands of feet over countless years, gleamed faintly in the pre-dawn light. These were sacred stones, witness to the entire arc of Roman history, silent keepers of stories too numerous to count. The air held a particular quality in these moments before sunrise. It seemed to carry weight, as though time itself moved more slowly, allowing space for contemplation. The tall columns of temples and basilicas rose into the lightening sky, their forms gradually emerging from shadow. The Capitoline Hill loomed nearby, its slopes still dark, its summit beginning to catch the first hints of approaching dawn. Everything waited. The city, the markets, the people, all poised in that delicate moment before the day truly began. And then, softly at first, the sun appeared. A thread of gold touched the eastern horizon, spreading gently across the sky. Light spilled over the hills surrounding Rome, moving like water, filling the valleys and streets with its warm glow. The Forum stones began to shine, shadows retreated into corners and archways. The oil lamps that had illuminated the early preparations were extinguished, their task complete. Day had arrived, and with it the ancient markets of Rome opened their arms to receive another day of life, trade, and human connection. The transformation was gradual, beautiful in its unhurried certainty. As light flooded the Forum, more voices joined the morning's chorus. Greetings called between familiar faces, the sounds of goods being arranged, pottery clinking softly, fabrics rustling, wooden crates settling onto stone created a gentle symphony of preparation. Children appeared, sent by their mothers to purchase the day's necessities, their young faces still soft with sleep, but alert to the adventure of the morning market. Elderly men and women, moving with the careful dignity of age, made their way along familiar paths, exchanging words with vendors they had known for decades. The Forum Romanum had always been the heart of Roman life. Long before the empire stretched across 3 continents, long before marble temples replaced wooden shrines, this space had served as a gathering place for the Latin peoples who first settled these hills. What began as simple practical exchanges, grain for tools, livestock for cloth, had evolved over centuries into something far more complex and magnificent. Yet beneath all the grandeur that would come, beneath the political speeches and religious ceremonies and great processions, the Forum remained, at its core, a marketplace. A place where people met to sustain their lives through trade and community. The earlier stalls had been temporary structures, simple wooden frames covered with cloth or thatch, assembled each morning and dismantled each evening. Farmers displayed their harvests on blankets spread across the ground. Potters arranged their vessels in careful rows. Cloth merchants hung their wares from ropes strung between poles. Everything was modest, functional, shaped by necessity rather than ambition. But Rome was never content to remain small. As the city grew, as its influence spread across Italia and beyond, the markets grew with it, becoming more permanent, more elaborate, more essential to the functioning of an increasingly complex society. Stone replaced wood gradually, deliberately. Permanent stalls lined the forum's edges, their thick walls providing shelter from sun and rain. Colonnaded porticos offered shaded walkways where shoppers could move comfortably even in the heat of summer. Public fountains provided fresh water, their constant murmur adding to the ambient music of market life. The sacred temples that had always overlooked the Forum were rebuilt in marble, their grandeur reflecting Rome's growing power and wealth. Yet the markets remained, occupying the same spaces they had always held, adapting to changes while maintaining their fundamental purpose. To walk through the Forum Romanum in the early morning was to step into a world both ancient and perpetually new. The stone pathways, worn into gentle depressions by generations of footsteps, guided visitors through spaces that had witnessed the entire span of Roman history. Here, where a vegetable seller now called out the freshness of her produce, senators had once debated the fate of nations. There, where a cobbler stitched leather beneath a canvas awning, great generals had celebrated victories with triumphal processions. The layers of time existed simultaneously, visible to those who knew how to look, felt by those who paused to consider the weight of continuity. The vendors knew these stones intimately. They knew which corner caught the first sunlight, which alcove offered the best shade at midday, which fountain provided the coldest water. They knew the rhythms of foot traffic, when the morning rush would arrive, when midday would bring a lull, when evening shoppers would appear seeking last-minute purchases. This knowledge was passed down through families, from grandparent to parent to child, creating dynasties of merchants whose names became synonymous with particular goods or particular locations within the market's geography. Conversations unfolded in the gentle morning light. A woman purchasing cheese paused to inquire about the vendor's daughter, recently married. The vendor smiled, sharing news while wrapping the purchase in cloth. Nearby, 2 old friends who met at the market each morning stood talking, their animated gestures punctuating stories that had been told and retold countless times but never lost their appeal. A young apprentice, nervous and eager, made his first solo purchase for his master's workshop, counting coins carefully while the patient merchant watched with the knowing smile of someone who remembered his own first days of responsibility. These interactions formed the true substance of the market. Yes, goods changed hands. Yes, coins were exchanged for merchandise. But beyond these practical transactions lived something more profound, the daily reinforcement of social bonds, the maintenance of community. the gentle affirmation that each person belonged to something larger than themselves. The markets were where Rome became real, where the abstract concept of empire manifested as human connection, where the vast machinery of civilization revealed itself to be, at its foundation, simply people caring for one another's needs. As morning deepened and the sun climbed higher, the market's energy grew. More stalls opened, more voices joined the chorus. The narrow lanes between vendor spaces filled with moving bodies, a constant flow of humanity pursuing the day's necessities and pleasures. Farmers from the Campanian countryside displayed produce still bearing the morning dew, crisp lettuces with roots still trailing soil, grapes so fresh their bloom had not yet been disturbed, figs that released their honeyed fragrance into the warming air. Fishmongers arranged their catches on beds of seaweed, the creatures still glistening, their scales catching the light like scattered jewels. Butchers hung cuts of meat on iron hooks, their practiced hands making quick work of preparation, their knives flashing in steady rhythm. The sensory richness became almost overwhelming. Colours, sounds, scents, all mingling into a vibrant tapestry that defined Roman life at its most immediate and authentic. The deep green of fresh herbs competed with the brilliant red of imported pomegranates and the golden amber of honey displayed in ceramic jars. The calls of vendors created a musical chaos, each voice rising and falling in practiced patterns designed to attract attention without causing offence. The fragrances layered upon one another, freshly baked bread underlying everything, sharp cheese cutting through, coriander and cumin adding exotic notes, the earthy smell of vegetables mingling with the salt tang of fish and the iron hint of fresh meat. In the background, always present, the architecture of empire loomed. The Basilica Aemilia, its facade adorned with detailed friezes depicting Rome's mythical and historical past, provided a permanent backdrop to the temporary bustle of commerce. The Temple of Saturn, its columns massive and imposing, reminded all who passed of the god's watchful presence over human affairs. The Curia, where the Senate gathered to debate law and policy, stood as a testament to political power. Yet none of these grand structures diminished the importance of the markets. Rather, they framed it, acknowledging through their very proximity that trade and daily sustenance were as essential to Rome's identity as law, religion, or military might. The morning hours belonged to the Forum, but Rome's markets extended far beyond this central space. Throughout the city, in neighbourhoods both wealthy and modest, smaller markets served local communities. Each had its own character, its own rhythms, its own constellation of familiar faces and trusted vendors. Some specialised in particular goods. There were fish markets near the Tiber, their proximity to the river ensuring the freshest catches. Vegetable markets clustered in the valleys between hills where morning shadows kept produce cool longer. Livestock markets operated on the city's outskirts where the sounds and smells of animals wouldn't disturb residential areas. Together, these various marketplaces formed a network that kept Rome fed, clothed, housed, and functioning. As the sun reached toward its zenith, the quality of light changed. Shadows grew shorter, sharper. The coolness of morning gave way to warmth that would build into the characteristic heat of a Roman day. Many shoppers completed their purchases and returned home, their baskets full, their morning obligation satisfied. Housewives hurried to prepare midday meals before the heat became oppressive. Slaves carried purchases back to their masters' homes, their burdens heavy but their steps quick with the efficiency of practice. The markets entered a different phase, less frantic, more languid, with vendors and the remaining customers moving at a pace suited to the climbing temperature. Some stalls closed for the midday hours, their owners retreating to nearby taverns or shaded corners to rest and share meals with colleagues. Small groups of merchants gathered in the cool interiors of wine shops, discussing business over cups of watered wine and simple fare, bread, olives, cheese, perhaps small fish preserved in brine. These midday gatherings served purposes beyond mere refreshment. Information was exchanged, deals were negotiated, partnerships were formed or dissolved. The informal networks that truly governed commerce operated most effectively in these casual settings where business and friendship blurred together. Yet even in these quieter hours, the markets never truly emptied. There were always those who needed something, who had been delayed in their morning errands, who suddenly remembered an item forgotten earlier. And the vendors, committed to their trade, remained present, ready to serve. This constancy was part of the market's magic, the assurance that whenever need arose, the marketplace would provide. It was a form of security deeply woven into Roman consciousness, a guarantee that the city's vast machinery of supply and distribution would not fail. The people who animated these spaces came from every stratum of Roman society. Wealthy matrons, accompanied by slaves carrying baskets, moved through the crowds with quiet authority, their fine clothes and jewellery marking their status. They might pause at a spice merchant stall, testing the quality of saffron between practised fingers, or examine silk fabrics with the critical eye of one accustomed to luxury. Their presence elevated a merchant's reputation. To be patronised by families of distinction brought prestige that attracted other customers and justified premium prices. Freedmen merchants, having earned their liberation through years of loyal service or successful business conducted on behalf of former masters, now operated their own stalls with pride and determination. Many had learned their trades while enslaved, acquiring skills and business acumen that made freedom viable. Some maintained relationships with former masters who became patrons, providing start-up capital or advantageous connections. Others struck out independently, their success or failure resting entirely on their own abilities. The freedman vendor occupied a unique position in Roman society, no longer slave but not quite fully integrated into the citizen class, existing in a liminal space where capability and ambition could sometimes overcome the limitations of birth. Slaves sent by their masters navigated the crowds with practiced efficiency, haggling over prices with the shrewdness of those who knew punishment awaited if they were cheated or if they paid more than necessary. The best of these shopping slaves developed expertise that made them valuable beyond mere labour. They knew which vendors could be trusted, which products were seasonal, how to judge quality by subtle signs. A slave with such knowledge might earn privileges, lighter work assignments, or promises of eventual manumission. The market became a proving ground where capability could be demonstrated and rewarded. Poor labourers, their hands calloused and their tunics patched, carefully counted small coins to stretch meagre resources as far as possible. For them, market shopping was less pleasure than calculation, how to feed a family on wages barely adequate, how to make clothing last another season, how to balance immediate needs against future necessities. Yet even in poverty, dignity could be maintained. The ritual of market shopping, of making choices and conducting transactions, affirmed one's participation in the social order. To buy bread, however humble, was to declare oneself a member of the community, entitled to its protections and bound by its obligations. Despite these differences in wealth and status, the markets imposed a kind of democracy. Everyone needed to eat. Everyone required clothing, household goods, the basic necessities of life. In the pursuit of these needs, patrician and plebeian stood side by side, breathing the same air, hearing the same calls from vendors, smelling the same mingled scents of commerce. The markets didn't erase social hierarchies. Rome would never allow that, but they created spaces where those hierarchies became temporarily less rigid, where human commonality asserted itself through the simple act of purchasing bread or oil or wine. Among the crowds moved figures whose presence added colour and intrigue to the market's daily theatre. Fortune-tellers offered to read futures in the patterns of dice or the lines of palms, their mystical pronouncements delivered with practised authority that convinced the credulous and entertained the sceptical. Street performers juggled flaming torches or performed acrobatic feats, their bodies moving with grace and precision, their upturned caps inviting coins from entertained passers-by. Musicians played flutes or lyres, their melodies weaving through the market's ambient noise, creating moments of beauty amid the commercial bustle. Beggars, some genuinely destitute and others skilled in the performance of poverty, positioned themselves at key locations near fountain entrances, beside temple steps, along pathways leading to popular stalls. Their appeals ranged from silent displays of affliction to eloquent orations detailing misfortunes that had reduced them to dependence on charity. Romans navigated these appeals with varying degrees of compassion and cynicism, some giving freely, others passing by unmoved, most falling somewhere between these extremes. Prostitutes, their presence tolerated if not celebrated, plied their trade in the margins, their painted faces and revealing clothing marking them as occupants of a particular social niche. Some operated from small rooms above taverns or shops, while others solicited directly in the streets. Their clients came from all classes, married men seeking variety, young men not yet able to afford marriage, travellers far from home. The prostitute occupied one of Rome's moral. The markets also attracted those whose business was less savoury. Pickpockets moved with careful subtlety through dense crowds, their quick fingers lifting purses from distracted shoppers who wouldn't notice the theft until much later. Con artists set up games of chance rigged to separate the foolish from their money, dice games with weighted cubes, shell games where the pea never ended up where the mark expected. Fences dealt in goods of questionable provenance, offering prices too good to ignore for those willing to overlook ethical considerations about where merchandise had originated. Rome's authorities made efforts to control such activities. The aediles, officials responsible for public order and market regulation, conducted periodic sweeps, arresting the most flagrant offenders. But the market's complexity, their constant motion and anonymous crowds, provided cover for those who operated on society's edges. A pickpocket caught in one district would simply move to another. A con artist driven from the Forum would set up near the Circus Maximus. The eternal dance between order and chaos, between regulation and evasion, played out daily in Rome's marketplaces. As afternoon wore on, another shift occurred. The character of trade evolved. Transactions became less about food and daily necessities and more about durable goods, luxuries, services. Customers with particular needs sought out specialized vendors, someone requiring a custom-made bridle for a horse, someone else seeking rare herbs for a specific medicinal preparation, another looking for a particular style of lamp or bowl or tool. These exchanges took longer, involved more negotiation, required greater expertise from the vendor. The pace slowed further, becoming almost leisurely, as merchant and customer discussed options, compared alternatives, arrived at agreements satisfactory to both. In certain corners of the Forum and the market surrounding it, one could find goods from distances that would astonish. Amber from the cold Baltic shores, its golden translucence capturing and holding light like frozen honey. The substance was prized for jewelry and amulets believed to possess protective properties. Silk from impossibly distant eastern kingdoms, its texture like nothing produced in the Mediterranean world. So fine it seemed to float rather than drape. Ivory from African elephants, carved into ornaments and tools by craftsmen who transformed the material into objects of beauty and utility. Spices from Arabia and beyond, their concentrated flavours and aromas speaking of places most Romans would never see. Pepper that made food come alive on the tongue. Cinnamon whose sweet warmth transformed the simplest dish. Cardamom that carried hints of forests no Roman had walked. These exotic items commanded high prices and attracted wealthy customers, but their presence in Roman markets testified to something remarkable: the extent of trade networks that connected Rome to virtually the entire known world. A Roman housewife purchasing pepper for her kitchen participated, however unknowingly, in a chain of exchanges that stretched across thousands of miles and involved dozens of intermediaries. The spice might have begun its journey in the distant east, passed through Indian ports, crossed Arabian deserts via camel caravan, been transferred to ships that sailed the Red Sea, been carried overland to Alexandria, loaded onto Mediterranean vessels, and finally arrived at Ostia before making its way to a Roman market stall. Each stage added cost, but also wonder. These goods represented connection across vast distances, evidence that Rome stood at the centre of a world-spanning web of trade. The great emporiums that facilitated this long-distance trade were themselves marvels of organisation and architecture. Rising multiple stories, their massive structures contained countless storage rooms, offices, and trading spaces. Here, merchants from various provinces and foreign kingdoms maintained permanent presences, managing the flow of goods to and from their homelands. The emporiums functioned as warehouses, marketplaces, and administrative centres simultaneously, their scale reflecting the immense volume of trade that sustained Rome's population and fed its appetite for both necessity and luxury. Walking through these emporiums was an experience distinct from the open-air markets of the Forum. The air inside was cooler, protected from direct sunlight by thick walls and high ceilings. Light entered through carefully placed windows and doorways, creating dramatic contrast between illuminated spaces and shadowed corners. The sounds changed too. Voices echoed differently in enclosed spaces. Footsteps resonated on stone floors. The ambient noise of the city muted to a distant murmur. There was a sense of permanence here, of infrastructure built to endure centuries, of Rome's confidence in its own future. The goods stored in these emporiums represented the wealth of an empire. Grain from Egypt, enough to feed Rome for months, rested in carefully maintained granaries where temperature and moisture were monitored to prevent spoilage. The granaries themselves were engineering achievements. Raised floors allowed air circulation that kept grain dry, thick walls maintained stable temperatures, and careful organisation ensured that older stores were used before newer arrivals. Officials kept meticulous records, tracking quantities with precision, because any miscalculation could mean shortage and hunger for Rome's vast population. Wine from Gaul, Spain, and Italia itself filled massive amphorae arranged in precise rows. Each region produced wines with distinctive characters: the robust reds of southern Gaul, the light whites of Campania, the sweet vintages of Greek islands. Merchants specialized in particular wines, developing expertise that allowed them to guarantee quality and authenticity. Wine was more than just a beverage in Roman culture. It was a marker of sophistication, a social lubricant, a component of religious ritual. The wine trade was correspondingly complex, with elaborate systems of classification, authentication, and pricing. Olive oil, that essential fluid that served as food, fuel, and medicine, occupied entire warehouses, its pungent aroma permeating the air. Romans consumed olive oil in quantities difficult for modern minds to comprehend. It dressed their salads, cooked their food, fueled their lamps, moisturized their skin, cleaned their bodies. A Roman household without adequate olive oil was unthinkable. The trade in oil was correspondingly enormous, with shipments arriving constantly from Spain, North Africa, Greece, and Italian groves. Quality varied dramatically, from the finest cold-pressed oils used for dressing foods to cheaper grades burned in lamps or used for industrial purposes. Marble blocks from Greek quarries waited to be transformed into temples, statues, and monuments. The stone came in varieties that connoisseurs could identify at a glance. The pure white Parian marble favoured for sculpture, the veined Carrara marble preferred for architectural elements, the coloured marbles from exotic locations that added visual drama to decorative schemes. Transporting these massive blocks required specialised ships with reinforced hulls, cranes powered by human labour, sledges that could move weights measured in tons. The marble trade represented Rome's aesthetic ambitions made tangible, its determination to build in materials that would endure millennia. Metals from Iberian mines, gold, silver, copper, tin, lead, sat under guard, representing not just material wealth but the currency of power itself. Gold and silver were minted into coins that facilitated commerce across the empire. Copper and tin were alloyed into bronze for tools, weapons, and artwork. Lead was shaped into pipes for Rome's famous water system. The metal trade involved enormous sums and attracted correspondingly intense security. Merchants who dealt in precious metals operated under constant risk of theft, requiring bodyguards, secure storage facilities, and trusted networks of partners who could be relied upon absolutely. The logistics required to move these goods from their origins to Roman storehouses were staggering. Trade routes stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas. Caravans of camels and pack animals traversed ancient roads, their progress measured in weeks and months. The Silk Road wound through Central Asian steppes and over mountain passes where altitude made breathing difficult. Trans-Saharan routes crossed deserts, where water was more valuable than gold. Alpine passes, treacherous with ice and snow much of the year, connected Italia with Gaul and Germania. Ships heavy with cargo sailed the Mediterranean, their crews reading stars and coastlines, their captains gambling weather and winds. Maritime trade was lucrative but dangerous. Storms could destroy ships and cargoes in hours. Pirates haunted certain routes, preying on vessels they deemed vulnerable. Navigational errors could drive ships onto rocks or reefs. Insurance systems developed to spread these risks, with multiple investors sharing both potential profits and potential losses from each voyage. Ship captains who proved skilled and lucky could accumulate substantial wealth, while those less fortunate might end their careers in debt or at the bottom of the sea. At each stage of these journeys, goods changed hands, fees were paid, risks were calculated. The system was complex, vulnerable to countless potential disruptions, yet it functioned with remarkable reliability year after year, decade after decade. This reliability rested on foundations both practical and cultural. The Roman road system that connected distant provinces, the Pax Romana that suppressed large-scale warfare and banditry, the common currency that facilitated transactions, the legal frameworks that enforced contracts and provided remedies for breaches. The Tiber River played an essential role in this vast supply network. Though Rome sat inland, the river provided access to the sea and the wider world beyond. Ships docked at Ostia, Rome's primary port, where cargo was transferred to smaller river barges capable of navigating the Tiber's currents and shallow places. These barges then made the journey upstream to Rome itself, their passage slow but sure, their arrival eagerly anticipated by merchants and officials tracking expected shipments. The riverbanks near Rome's markets became extensions of the marketplace itself, with goods moving directly from boat to warehouse to stall in continuous flow. Portus, the great artificial harbour constructed under the Emperor Claudius and expanded by Trajan, represented Roman engineering and ambition at their peak. This massive complex of basins, canals, warehouses, and administrative buildings transformed Rome's ability to receive goods from across the empire and beyond. Ships that once had to wait days or weeks for favourable conditions to dock at Ostia could now enter the protected harbours of Portus regardless of weather. The facilities could accommodate dozens of vessels simultaneously, speeding the unloading process and reducing the vulnerability of cargoes to theft, damage, or spoilage. To stand at Portus as ships arrived was to witness empire made tangible. Vessels from Egypt bearing grain and papyrus, their sails marked with symbols of Alexandrian merchants. These grain ships were enormous by ancient standards, some measuring over 100 feet in length, their holds capable of carrying hundreds of tons. Their arrival was carefully scheduled and anxiously awaited, for Egypt's grain fed much of Rome's population. ships from North Africa, heavy with wild animals destined for the arena, their holds echoing with roars and calls. Transporting living animals was particularly challenging, requiring food, water, and careful handling to keep the creatures alive and healthy enough to provide entertainment. Greek vessels carrying wine, oil, and artwork. Many items classified as Greek were actually produced throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, in Asia Minor, Syria, the islands, but they carried the cultural cachet of Greek civilization, which Romans simultaneously envied and claimed as their own heritage. Gallic boats loaded with salted meats and woolen textiles. The cold climate of northern provinces made them ideal for certain products, preserved foods that wouldn't spoil in warm Mediterranean temperatures, thick woolens perfect for winter or for Roman soldiers serving in cold frontier regions. Iberian ships bearing metals and garum, that fermented fish sauce Romans adored. Each arrival represented connections maintained across vast distances, relationships forged through mutual benefit, the reality that Rome's greatness depended on its ability to draw resources from an empire that spanned the known world. The workers who laboured at Portus and along the Tiber formed their own community, with its own hierarchies, traditions, and culture. Dock workers, organised into guilds, moved cargo with practised efficiency, their strong backs and calloused hands essential to the functioning of trade. These guilds, or collegia, provided not just labour organisation but social identity and support. Members paid dues that funded common meals, burial expenses, and aid for those injured or fallen on hard times. The guilds negotiated collectively with merchants and officials, securing better terms than individual workers could achieve alone. Ship captains, some citizens and some foreigners, commanded respect and wielded considerable influence, their knowledge and skills making them valuable to merchant enterprises. A captain who knew the Mediterranean's winds and currents, who could navigate by stars when coastlines disappeared, who understood how to manage crews and cargoes under challenging conditions, such a person was worth substantial investment. Many captains had been sailors first, learning their craft through years of experience before being entrusted with command. The best became wealthy, investing profits in their own ships and becoming merchants in their own right. Customs officials checked manifests, assessed duties, prevented smuggling, or were bribed to overlook it. The Roman tax system relied heavily on customs duties, with goods entering the empire taxed at substantial rates. This created obvious incentives for evasion. Merchants who could avoid or reduce duties gained competitive advantages. Officials who could be corrupted found the temptation of bribes difficult to resist. The resulting dance of enforcement and evasion was as old as taxation itself, a perennial feature of commerce wherever governments sought to extract revenue from trade. Warehouse managers maintained complex records, tracking what came in, what went out, what remained in storage. These records were essential for merchants who might have goods scattered across multiple locations, for officials monitoring grain supplies, for tax collectors calculating duties owed. The work required literacy, numeracy, and meticulous attention to detail. Warehouse managers occupied positions of trust and responsibility, their accuracy or lack thereof having direct financial consequences for those who employed them. Together, these various roles created a world within a world, a specialized community dedicated to the eternal task of keeping Rome supplied. The people of Portus lived lives shaped by rhythms different from those in the city itself, governed by shipping seasons, by the arrival and departure of vessels, by the flow of goods rather than the political calendar or religious festivals that structured time for most Romans. As ships were unloaded and cargoes moved toward the city, certain goods commanded particular attention and care. Spices, precious metals, fine textiles, rare woods. These valuable commodities received armed guards for their journey from port to warehouse. The risk of theft was constant and significant, with organised gangs sometimes attempting to intercept shipments. Merchants invested heavily in security, hiring former soldiers as guards, bribing officials for protection, cultivating relationships with local authorities who could provide assistance if problems arose. The economic stakes were enormous, with fortunes made or lost depending on whether expensive cargoes reached their destinations intact. The variety of goods flowing through Rome's markets reflected not just the empire's geographic extent, but its cultural diversity. Each region contributed its specialties, the products for which it was renowned. Gaul offered beer, preferred by northern peoples over wine, and woolen cloaks suited to cold climates. Spain provided garum, that pungent condiment Romans adored despite its off-putting production process. Small fish fermented in brine until they liquefied into a salty, umami-rich sauce. Greece went wine, oil, honey, and refined luxuries, carved gemstones, fine ceramics, bronze sculptures that graced wealthy homes. Africa contributed grain that sustained Rome's population, wild animals that died in the arena, exotic woods like citrus that were carved into precious furniture, and purple dye extracted from murex shells, the colour of emperors and the very wealthy. Syria and the eastern provinces offered spices, incense that filled temples with fragrant smoke, silk that arrived via the Silk Road, and the sophisticated crafts of ancient civilizations that predated Rome by millennia. Glass from Syria was particularly prized, with Syrian craftsmen having perfected glass-blowing techniques that produced vessels of remarkable delicacy and beauty. These eastern provinces also served as intermediaries for goods from even more distant origins: India, the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps even China, though direct contact was minimal. Certain goods acquired almost mythical status. Pepper, transported from India through multiple intermediaries, commanded prices that seemed absurd even to wealthy Romans, yet demand never flagged. The tiny dried berries added such remarkable flavour that they justified their expense. The finest silk coming from China via the Silk Road's countless exchanges and translations was worth literally its weight in gold. The material was so light, so lustrous, so unlike anything produced in the West that it seemed almost magical. Frankincense and myrrh, essential for religious ceremonies, travelled from the Arabian Peninsula through trade routes controlled by the intermediaries who guarded their monopolies jealously. These resins, when burned, produced fragrances believed pleasing to the gods, making them indispensable for proper ritual observance. Yet for most Romans, daily market visits involved humbler transactions. The purchase of bread, the most basic staple, baked fresh each day because preservatives didn't exist, and stale bread lost appeal quickly. A measure of wine, watered before consumption, as undiluted wine was considered barbaric and potentially dangerous. Olive oil for cooking and for lamps, the dual purposes meaning consumption was substantial, even in modest households. Fresh vegetables when available, dried or preserved when not. Beans, lentils, onions, garlic, cabbage, turnips. Perhaps a small fish or piece of meat when budget allowed, though many ordinary Romans ate meat only during festivals when public largesse provided it. These simple exchanges, repeated millions of times across Rome's vast population, formed the true foundation of the market economy, the constant necessary provision of life's essentials. The bread itself carried deep significance. Rome's government recognized that ensuring adequate grain supplies and affordable bread was essential to maintaining public order. The famous bread and rucus's formula, providing food and entertainment to keep the masses content, was not cynical manipulation, but practical necessity born from experience. Grain shortages had sparked riots in the past, threatening the stability of the state. To prevent such crises, Rome institutionalized grain distributions. Under the imperial system, hundreds of thousands of citizens became entitled to free or subsidized grain supplies. Private bakeries which processed grain into bread became key nodes in this system, their ovens never cooling, their output carefully monitored. The smell of baking bread was as much a part of Rome's identity as marble temples or aqueduct water. Markets also served spiritual functions, their commercial purposes intertwined with religious observance. Temples often maintained their own market spaces, selling ritual items, accepting offerings, providing services related to worship. A person preparing to make a sacrifice might purchase a suitable animal from vendors operating near the temple. Someone seeking divine favour might buy a votive offering, a small terracotta figurine, a bronze plaque, a painted tablet, to dedicate at a shrine. The boundary between commercial and religious space blurred in these contexts, reflecting Roman pragmatism about the material requirements of spiritual life. Certain festivals transformed entire districts into temporary sacred markets, where religious observation and commerce merged seamlessly. During the Saturnalia, that great winter celebration when social norms inverted and gift-giving became obligatory, the markets took on almost carnival atmosphere. Vendors prepared special wares, wax candles symbolizing the returning light after winter solstice, small gifts appropriate for exchange, toys for children, gaming pieces for the dice games that were permissible during the festival. The markets during these days crowded beyond normal capacity, animated by excitement and license that characterized Saturnalia's temporary suspension of ordinary rules. Masters might serve their slaves during Saturnalia as custom dictated, but first both needed to visit markets to purchase the material elements of celebration. The economic impact of such festivals was significant, with merchants depending on these periodic surges in demand. A successful Saturnalia could provide profits that sustained a vendor through slower periods. The festival also reinforced commercial relationships, as merchants gave small gifts to regular customers, strengthening bonds of loyalty and mutual goodwill. The Parentalia, that period of honouring ancestors, brought its own market customs. Families purchased offerings for grave sites, wine to pour as libation, food to leave as symbolic sustenance, flowers to decorate tombs, small luxuries the deceased had enjoyed in life. Vendors near cemeteries specialized in these memorial goods, their presence testimony to the Roman conviction that relationships with the dead required maintenance through material gestures. Death did not sever connections, it merely transformed them, and markets adapted to serve this spiritual economy as readily as they served physical needs. Religious dedications often involved substantial purchases. A merchant whose ships had survived dangerous voyages might commission a marble votive plaque for a temple to Neptune, god of the sea, thanking the deity for protection and implicitly requesting continued favour. A farmer who'd enjoyed a particularly good harvest might donate a share of proceeds to Ceres, goddess of grain, acknowledging her role in agricultural success. A woman who had survived childbirth might offer gifts to Juno, protector of mothers, expressing gratitude for safe delivery and requesting blessings for the child's future. These transactions, neither purely commercial nor purely religious but a synthesis of both, reinforced the web of obligations and gratitudes that structured Roman spiritual life. The gods were understood to respond to proper attention and offerings, creating a reciprocal relationship where human devotion earned divine favour. Markets facilitated this relationship by making available the material means through which devotion could be expressed. Certain markets specialized in animals for sacrifice, sheep, goats, birds, even cattle, for particularly significant dedications. These creatures were inspected carefully, as religious law required that sacrificial animals be perfect, unblemished, suitable offerings to the gods. The priests who sold such animals, or certified their acceptability, occupied positions of significant trust and authority. A flawed sacrifice could offend divine powers, bringing misfortune rather than blessing. So the stakes of these transactions extended beyond economics into the realm of cosmic consequence. Vendors developed expertise in identifying perfect specimens, guaranteeing their quality, and maintaining the health and appearance of animals awaiting purchase. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, the markets began another transformation. Shadows lengthened, stretching across stones warmed by a full day of sunlight. The quality of light softened, losing its harsh midday intensity, taking on the golden tones that would later be called the golden hour. The temperature moderated, the heat dissipating, comfort returning to the air. For many Romans, this was the most pleasant time to be in the markets, the day's obligations completed, the evening hours available for more leisurely engagement. Some stalls began to close, their owners packing unsold goods, covering displays with cloth to protect them from dew, preparing for the next day. Perishable items that hadn't sold were offered at reduced prices rather than risk spoilage overnight. Customers alert to such opportunities could find bargains in these final hours. Other stalls remained open, serving customers who worked through the day and could shop only in evening hours. Labourers whose work ended with sunset, craftsmen finishing projects in their workshops, freed slaves whose jobs kept them occupied until evening, these formed a distinct evening clientele. The character of crowds changed. Fewer women whose domestic responsibilities called them home to prepare evening meals for families. More men stopping at markets on their way from workplaces, perhaps meeting friends for conversation and a cup of wine at one of the taverns that dotted market districts. These taverns, simple establishments offering wine, basic food and companionship, served as social centres for working-class Romans. Here, after the day's labour, men could relax, exchange news, discuss politics or sports or neighbourhood gossip, momentarily setting aside the burdens of daily survival. Young people, finished with the day's lessons or labour, seeking entertainment and social connection. The markets in evening hours offered opportunities for courtship, for young men and women to see and be seen under conditions less restrictive than daytime shopping allowed. A young man might linger near a stall browsing goods he didn't need, hoping to catch the eye of a particular young woman. A group of young women might walk through market streets together, their laughter and conversation creating their own kind of commerce. The exchange of social bonds, the market of young romance. As darkness approached, lamps began to appear. Oil lamps in countless variations, simple clay vessels with single wicks, their design unchanged for centuries. Elaborate bronze creations with multiple flames, their decorative elements displaying the owner's wealth or taste. Lanterns with translucent horn panels protecting flames from wind while allowing light to escape. Their light was soft, warm, fundamentally different from the harsh illumination that would characterize later eras. Lamplight created pools of visibility surrounded by shadow, intimate spaces carved from the darkness. Under these gentle flames, the markets took on an almost dreamlike quality. Familiar spaces rendered mysterious and romantic by altered light. Some markets specialized in evening trade. Near the Circus Maximus and other entertainment venues, vendors sold snacks, wine, small goods to crowds attending races or theatrical performances. These markets operated on different schedules, their busiest hours coinciding with evening entertainment. The atmosphere was festive, energized, focused more on pleasure than necessity. Street food vendors offered quick meals, grilled meats on skewers, sausages seasoned with herbs and spices, fried dough drizzled with honey, cups of hot salt soup in cold weather. The smells were enticing, designed to attract hungry crowds with disposable income and appetites sharpened by entertainment and social excitement. In quieter neighbourhoods, evening markets maintained more subdued atmospheres. Locals made last-minute purchases, a forgotten ingredient for the evening meal, additional oil for lamps that would burn through the night, perhaps a small treat for children as reward for good behaviour. These transactions were quick, familiar, conducted between people who knew each other, who had conducted similar exchanges countless times before. The vendors at these neighbourhood markets often extended credit to trusted customers, maintaining informal accounts settled weekly or monthly, their record keeping a mixture of written notes and reliable memory built over years of repeated interaction. The night markets, those that operated in the darkest hours, served particular populations and purposes. Tavern keepers purchased supplies for the night's business, wine to serve customers, food for simple meals, oil for lamps that would burn until dawn. Night workers, guards who patrolled streets and buildings, prostitutes whose trade increased after dark, bakers who worked through darkness to have bread ready for morning, made their purchases when their schedules allowed. Some goods, like fresh fish that needed to be sold quickly before spoiling, were offered at reduced prices in late hours, creating opportunities for those alert enough and awake enough to take advantage. And some commerce, best conducted away from daylight scrutiny, found cover in darkness. Stolen goods were quietly exchanged in shadowed corners, buyer and seller both aware of but not discussing the merchandise's questionable provenance. Forbidden transactions, illegal drugs, dangerous weapons, services that violated law or custom were completed with minimal conversation and maximum caution. The night markets had their own rules, their own ethics that existed parallel to but distinct from daytime norms. The social bonds forged in markets extended across generations. A vendor's regular customers became more than commercial relationships. They became friends, confidants, sometimes even family through marriage connections. The baker's daughter might marry the olive oil merchant's son, their union joining two commercial enterprises and creating networks of mutual support and shared interest. Children grew up accompanying parents to markets, absorbing the patterns of interaction, learning which vendors to trust and which to approach with caution, beginning their own education in the complex social choreography that made market relationships function smoothly. These relationships formed crucial elements of social capital, networks of mutual obligation and support that could mean the difference between surviving and thriving, particularly for those without significant wealth. A vendor who knew a customer faced hard times might extend credit or reduce prices, investments in maintaining a relationship that might prove valuable when circumstances reversed. A customer who heard of opportunities might direct them toward a trusted merchant, repaying past favours and maintaining bonds of reciprocity that structured much of Roman social interaction. Reputation mattered enormously in market contexts. A vendor known for fair dealing, quality goods and reasonable prices could build a loyal customer base that provided stable income across decades. Reputation attracted new customers through word-of-mouth recommendations that constituted the most effective form of marketing in an era before mass media. Conversely, a merchant caught cheating, using false weights to short customers, misrepresenting goods as being of higher quality than they actually were, adulterating products to increase profits, might find business evaporating as word spread through customer networks. The market's gossip networks were remarkably efficient. A customer cheated in the morning might tell the story to friends at midday, who would repeat it to their own contacts by evening, creating ripples of information that could reach across the city within a day. In an era before newspapers or electronic communication, these oral networks served as primary means of information distribution, their speed and reach often surprising to those accustomed to slower forms of communication. Markets also served as information exchanges beyond commercial gossip. News travelled through marketplaces with remarkable speed. A vendor who had heard something interesting, political developments, military victory or defeats, scandals involving prominent citizens, would share it with customers, who would carry it further, creating ripples of information that could spread across the city within hours. Merchants whose businesses connected them to distant places brought news from provinces, creating windows onto the wider empire for Romans who would never travel far from home. The information flowing through markets wasn't always accurate. Rumours mixed with facts, speculation blended with observation, wishful thinking coloured reports, but the market served as forums where information could be tested, compared, evaluated through collective discussion. A rumour reported by multiple vendors from different sources gained credibility. A story that shifted dramatically in different tellings was approached with skepticism. The market's information ecosystem, while imperfect, provided Romans with their primary means of staying informed about events beyond their immediate experience. Friendships formed in markets could cross social boundaries that remained rigid in other contexts. A wealthy patron and a humble vendor, thrown together regularly through commercial transactions, might develop genuine affection and mutual respect. While the social hierarchy would never truly dissolve, the patron would always be patron, the vendor always a supplier. Within the specific context of their market relationship, a kind of equality could emerge, bounded and limited, but real within its boundaries. The patron might ask the vendor's advice on purchases, valuing expertise over social status. The vendor might share news or gossip with the patron, creating moments of genuine communication across class lines. Markets also provided spaces where women could operate with unusual independence. Roman society restricted women's public roles severely in many contexts. But markets offered opportunities for female merchants, vendors, and traders to conduct business, control income, and interact with broader communities. Women sold produce from family farms, their knowledge of agricultural products making them effective salespeople. They operated food stalls, preparing and selling meals that fed workers and travellers. They dealt in textiles and clothing, their expertise in fabric, styles, and needlework making them authorities in these domains. They managed shops, sometimes inherited from husbands or fathers, sometimes built through their own entrepreneurship. These roles provided not just income but agency, the satisfaction of skill and competence, connection to commercial and social networks that extended beyond domestic confines. A woman successful in market commerce gained respect that transcended gender limitations. Her opinion on commercial matters carried weight. Her business connections provided value to family and associates. Her income contributed to household prosperity and might give her leverage in domestic decisions. Slave women and freedwomen often operated market stalls on behalf of owners or patrons, their success directly impacting their treatment and, for slaves, their chances of eventual manumission. A slave with proven business acumen became valuable beyond mere labour, potentially earning privileges, better food, lighter workloads, greater autonomy, or faster paths to freedom. Masters recognized that slaves with entrepreneurial ability might generate more value through semi-independent operation than through direct supervision. Some slaves were allowed to keep portions of profits, accumulating peculium that could eventually purchase their freedom. A freed woman with a successful market business might accumulate enough wealth to purchase her own slaves, replicating the social structure that had once constrained her, pursuing the Roman dream of upward mobility through commerce. The former slave become slave owner was not uncommon, representing both the opportunities Roman society provided for advancement and the degree to which its hierarchical structure was internalized even by those it oppressed. The children who grew up in market environments absorbed an education different from but complementary to formal schooling. They learned mathematics through handling coins and making change, developing practical numeracy that served them throughout life. They developed social skills through observing negotiations and interactions, learning to read people, to assess intentions, to navigate complex social dynamics. They acquired practical knowledge, which products were seasonal and when to expect them, how to judge quality through observation and testing, what constituted fair prices, and when vendors were attempting to overcharge. For children of merchant families, the market was both workplace and classroom, the site where they prepared for lives that would likely follow patterns similar to their parents. A boy accompanying his father to market wasn't merely helping, he was apprenticing, learning the trade he would someday inherit. A girl assisting her mother at a market stall was acquiring skills she might use throughout her life, whether continuing in commerce or applying market knowledge to household management. As Rome's empire expanded and matured over centuries, the markets reflected changing realities. Goods that had once been exotic became commonplace. Pepper, initially a rare luxury, became common enough that middle-class households could afford it. Silk, while still expensive, appeared regularly in markets rather than being the extraordinary rarity it had once been. Trade routes that had been risky ventures became established highways, their paths known, their dangers mapped and somewhat mitigated. Merchants who had begun as scrappy opportunists founded commercial dynasties, their descendants operating businesses built on foundations laid generations earlier. The markets grew more organized, more regulated, more integrated into formal imperial administration. Tax collectors monitored transactions with increasing efficiency, their records becoming more sophisticated and harder to evade. Regulations specified standards for weights and measures, with periodic inspections ensuring compliance and punishments for those caught using fraudulent equipment. Guilds formed to protect merchant interests and regulate competition, creating cartels that sometimes served members' interests at the expense of consumers, but also provided stability and predictability to commercial relationships. Yet beneath these increasing layers of formality and control, the fundamental nature of markets remained constant. They were still places where people came to meet needs, to connect with community, to participate in the grand project of keeping a vast city alive and functioning. The basic transaction, goods or services exchanged for payment, buyer and seller reaching agreement satisfactory to both, was the same whether conducted in the earliest days of the Republic or the height of empire. This continuity provided a kind of anchor, a reminder that despite all changes, some fundamental aspects of human life remained reassuringly stable. The later centuries of empire brought gradual transformations that even the markets couldn't ignore. As political and military situations grew more complex, as external pressures increased, and internal cohesion sometimes fractured, the markets reflected these broader trends. Trade routes that had been secure for generations became dangerous, threatened by barbarian raids or civil conflicts. Goods that had flowed reliably for centuries became scarce, their supply chains disrupted by warfare or administrative collapse. Prices, once stable within predictable ranges, fluctuated unpredictably as currency debasement and inflation eroded economic certainty. The great emporiums and warehouses, built for an empire confident in its permanence, sometimes stood partially empty, their vast capacities exceeding the reduced volumes of trade. Sections of these massive structures were abandoned, their maintenance costs no longer justified by the activity they housed. Yet even in decline they retained their magnificence, their architectural ambition testament to an earlier era's confidence and capability. The populations using markets changed as well. New peoples settling within the empire's boundaries through migration, treaty or conquest brought their own commercial traditions and preferences. Germanic tribes people, Goths, Vandals and others who had once been enemies became neighbours and customers. The ethnic and cultural diversity that had always characterized Rome intensified, creating markets where Latin, Greek, Germanic languages, Aramaic, Coptic, and countless others could be heard. Vendors adapted, learning enough phrases in multiple tongues to conduct business, the market's practical demands overriding linguistic barriers. During periods of political instability, when currency lost reliability and inflation eroded purchasing power, markets adapted through barter and alternative economic arrangements. A farmer might exchange grain directly for tools, voiding currency altogether and returning to more primitive forms of trade. A craftsman might accept payment in goods rather than coins of uncertain value, trusting tangible merchandise over abstract currency. These adaptations, reminiscent of earlier, simpler economic systems, demonstrated the market's fundamental resilience. Commerce would continue regardless of what forms it took, as long as people had needs and others had goods to meet them. Christian communities growing through these later centuries brought new patterns to market life. Churches established charitable distributions, competing with and complementing traditional markets by providing food and necessities to the poor. Christian merchants sometimes signalled their faith through symbols on their stalls, or through practices like refusing to work on Sundays, creating networks of trust among co-religionists who believed fellow Christians would deal honestly. Festivals began to shift from the traditional Roman religious calendar to Christian observances, changing the rhythm of market activity as Easter and Christmas became occasions for special commerce. Yet through all these changes, the basic functions persisted. People still needed bread, still required clothing, still sought the goods and services that markets provided. The faces changed, the languages evolved, the specific goods available shifted, but the fundamental human reality remained. Communities required spaces where needs could be met through exchange, where social bonds could be maintained through regular interaction, where the complex task of sustaining urban life could be accomplished through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals, pursuing their own interests in ways that collectively served everyone. As the classical Roman world gradually transformed into something new, as the structures that had sustained empire for centuries slowly gave way to emerging medieval realities, the markets remained. Their forms evolved. The grand emporiums might fall into disuse, their stones eventually scavenged for other building projects, but smaller localized markets continued. The volume of long-distance trade declined, the connections to distant provinces weakening, but local and regional commerce persisted. The specific goods available changed, luxury imports becoming rare again as they had been in Rome's earliest days. But basic necessities continued to flow. The physical spaces of Roman markets, those stones worn smooth by countless feet, those walls that had sheltered generations of vendors, those fountains that had provided water to countless thousands, these endured in various ways. Some were buried under the accumulation of centuries, layers of rubble and soil covering them as the city contracted, and areas that had been bustling commercial districts became grazing land or gardens. These buried markets waited, patient and silent, for archaeologists centuries later to rediscover them, to carefully excavate their remains, to reconstruct from fragments the vibrant life they had once contained. Others were repurposed, their Roman foundations supporting medieval and Renaissance structures. A medieval church might rise above a Roman marketplace, its stones recycled from ancient stalls, its courtyard occupying space where vendors had once called out prices. A Renaissance palace might incorporate walls that had once been part of an emporium, their original function forgotten, but their structural integrity preserved and valued. A few spaces maintained continuity of function across millennia, the same ground still serving as marketplace, the same basic layout preserved through generation after generation of use. Modern Romans might shop in markets occupying sites where their ancestors had shopped 2,000 years earlier, unaware of the depth of continuity beneath their feet, unconsciously participating in traditions stretching back to the city's founding. Today, walking through Rome, one can still find traces of these ancient markets woven into the modern cityscape. The Trajan's market ruins, remarkably preserved, allow visitors to wander through spaces that once buzzed with commercial activity. The curved facade rising in multiple levels still displays the architectural sophistication that made these emporiums marvels of their age. Visitors can walk into ancient shops, their doorways and storage spaces intact, and imagine the goods that once filled them, the vendors who once operated there, the customers who once browsed and haggled and purchased. The Forum Romanum, though now silent and depopulated, still displays the architectural framework that once contained bustling stalls and crowds. The stones, worn smooth by countless footsteps, remain underfoot. The columns that provided shade and structure still rise toward the sky. The fountains, though no longer flowing, mark spaces where water once splashed and people once gathered. Walking through the Forum today requires imagination to populate its emptiness with the life it once held, but the traces are there for those willing to look and envision. Excavations throughout the city periodically uncover market buildings, storage facilities, shops, evidence of the commercial infrastructure that was so central to Roman life. Each discovery adds details to our understanding, revealing the complexity and sophistication of Roman commercial systems. Preserved floor plans show the organization of stalls. Recovered goods indicate what was sold and where. Inscriptions name merchants and describe their trades. Slowly, painstakingly, the accumulated evidence of archaeology reconstructs a world long vanished, but still speaking through its physical remains. But the true legacy of Rome's markets exists not just in stones and ruins. It lives in the continuous tradition of urban marketplaces that stretches from ancient Rome through medieval markets to modern commercial centres. The basic patterns established by Roman merchants, the organisation of goods by type, with similar vendors clustering together, the development of specialised market districts, each serving particular needs or clienteles, the relationship between long-distance trade and local retail, with imported goods flowing through distribution networks to reach individual consumers, the integration of markets into urban planning, recognizing their essential role in city function. These became templates that shaped commercial development across centuries and continents. European medieval markets inherited Roman patterns, often literally occupying the same spaces and following organizational principles established during the empire. Islamic markets, though developed independently in many ways, shared fundamental characteristics with Roman predecessors, suggesting common responses to common commercial needs. Modern shopping districts, with their specialization and geographic clustering, echo ancient patterns even when planners are unaware of the historical precedents. The social functions of markets too persist. Modern farmers' markets, with their emphasis on direct connection between producers and consumers, recreate relationships that were standard in Roman markets. Shopping districts that become social gathering places where people go not just to purchase but to see and be seen, to meet friends, to participate in community life. These serve functions identical to those served by Roman markets. The technologies have changed dramatically, the scale has shifted. The specific forms are almost unrecognizable compared to ancient predecessors, yet the fundamental human impulses remain the same. In the quiet moments of Roman nights, after markets had closed and vendors had returned home, after the last customers had made their final purchases and the last lamps had been extinguished, the market spaces rested. The stones, warm from the day's sun, slowly released their heat into the cool night air. Shadows filled the spaces that had been crowded with humanity hours before. The scents of the day, bread and oil and spices and humanity, lingered faintly, blending with the clean smell of night air. The city slept, or at least grew quiet, preparing to repeat the cycle when dawn arrived. These spaces, empty of people but full of memory, held within them the accumulated weight of all the transactions, all the conversations, all the human connections that had unfolded over centuries. If stones could remember, these would recall countless individual stories. The farmer who saved for years to purchase his daughter's dowry, finally completing the transaction with pride and relief. The merchant whose risky venture in importing Eastern spices paid off spectacularly, setting his family's fortune for generations. The widow who kept her family fed through shrewd market transactions, her skill at bargaining and careful management stretching limited resources far enough to ensure survival. The young couple who met by chance at a vendor's stall, their eyes meeting over displayed goods, beginning a relationship that would span a lifetime. The markets of Rome were never just about commerce, never simply about the exchange of goods for coins. They were stages where the full drama of human life unfolded: ambition and desperation, generosity and greed, hope and disappointment, connection and loss. They were mirrors reflecting the society that created and sustained them, showing Rome at its most authentic, stripped of pretense, engaged in the honest work of survival and flourishing. They were perhaps more than temples or forums or palaces, the places where Rome's true character revealed itself, where the daily reality of life in the eternal city was most visible and most immediate. And so the story of Rome's markets is really the story of Rome itself, a civilization built not just through military conquest or political genius or engineering prowess, but through the patient daily work of countless ordinary people meeting in markets to exchange goods, share information, forge relationships, and maintain the intricate web of connections that makes urban life possible. This work, unglamorous and often invisible to history, recorded in account books rather than chronicles, remembered in family stories rather than monumental inscriptions, was no less essential than the grand gestures that filled the historical record. As we rest here at the end of this gentle journey, having walked in imagination through the markets of ancient Rome, having glimpsed the lives of those who filled those spaces with purpose and energy, we carry with us something of their world. The stones remain, silent witnesses to vanished vitality. The stories persist, passed down through centuries, transformed and embellished perhaps, but still connecting us to that distant past. And somewhere in the quiet of this moment, as sleep approaches and consciousness softens, we can almost feel the presence of all those countless ordinary people who built their lives, day by patient day, in the markets of eternal Rome, their voices still echoing faintly across the centuries, their footsteps still marking the stones, their essential humanity still reaching across time to touch our own.